So this is the first ever office hours. We have office hours every fourth Wednesday of the month. This one is a little bit out of cycle, but our next office hours will be March 24th. They're at 12 p.m. Central, and they're an opportunity for you to speak and learn with presenters in regenerative ag on their expertise and relevant topics and answer questions. So next, could I ask the person to mute themselves? And we also have organizational spotlight office hours, which are also held every second Wednesday of the month at 12 p.m. Central. And they are also an opportunity for you to connect with Regain partner organizations and learn about the things that they have going on and their programming. So that next session will be March 10th with Megan Filbert of PFI. I'll share all of this information in the chat so that you could be linked directly to all of this information that I just shared. And I'll just do a quick introduction to our great speakers today and our topic. This meeting is titled, "Oh, the Places Carbon Can Go," and it is on soil carbon science and the potential for regenerative grazing to sequester carbon. Our speakers today are Dr. Jasmine Dillon, Associate Professor of Beef and Dairy Agroecosystems with the College of Agricultural Sciences at Colorado State University, and Dr. Megan Mackmueller, Research Scientist with Colorado State University College of Agricultural Sciences, Soil and Crop Sciences. And with that, I will hand it over to our presenters to get this started.
Good afternoon. Can everyone see my slides and hear me okay? All right. Thank you all for joining us today. Thank you, Tracy, the Wallace Center, Elizabeth, Jane. Thank you all for having us in your inaugural office hours session. We hope we can make it a good one for you. I want to apologize in advance for any demolition noise you hear in the background on Meg's part and any copious laughter you hear in the background on my part, because someone in my house is in a meeting and it's apparently quite amusing. So aside from that, both Dr. Mackmueller and I talk pretty fast, so please let us know in the chat if you need us to slow down. And with that, I'm going to get right into it because we have a lot of content and want to have a good discussion today. So Tracy, thank you for the introduction. I am Dr. Jasmine Dillon, and Dr. Megan Mackmueller and I will be switching off to talk about our subject today, which is all the places, the places that carbon can go. So as many of you know, soil underpins many of the ecosystem services that we rely on for life. And because of this kind of foundational role that soil plays in our lives, it exists at the nexus of some of our grand challenges. And by grand challenges, I mean, by now, most of you all have probably heard the narrative, population is growing somewhere 8, 9, 10 billion by 2050 and beyond. And those people need food and they need fiber. And so there's increasing pressure on Earth systems to produce the agricultural products we need, but also reduce the environmental impacts that the production of those products causes. And so the ecosystem services that we rely on for those processes include everything from water purification, climate regulation, nutrient cycling, biodiversity, and not least of which is carbon sequestration. And carbon sequestration will be the focus of our talk today. What's pretty exciting is that we'll talk about the broad concept of carbon sequestration and then bring to you a new framework for the way that we think about organic matter and the way that we think about carbon sequestration and how we can not only capture, but also keep carbon in our soils. So globally, soils contain about 50,400 billion metric tons of carbon, which is a huge amount. And I'll try to give you a little bit of context as we go through the presentation for how that relates to other pools of carbon on Earth. But soil stores more carbon than vegetation and atmosphere combined. So when you think about Earth and all the places that carbon can be stored, the ocean holds about 77% of the carbon on Earth. Soil stores about 5% of the carbon on Earth. Fossil fuel living organisms, so plants and animals, store about 1.2%, and then atmosphere holds about 1.5%, with fossil fuels containing the balance there. And most of that carbon is stored below ground. So what you're looking at in this figure is different reservoirs of carbon and the total amount of carbon. So anything above this line is above ground carbon storage, and anything below the line in brown is below ground. And just by looking at that, you can see that most of the carbon stored is stored in our sub and topsoil. So this is where we're going to focus as we delve in deeper today. Soil has been recognized as so important that it is foundational to achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. For those of you who aren't familiar with them, the UN developed this set of, there are 17 shown here, I believe there are a few more, but this set of goals that are supposed to serve as guidelines for how, as economic development progresses globally, how can we ensure that that happens in an equitable, just, and sustainable way? And so they've kind of categorized the different needs of humans into things such as alleviating poverty, zero hunger, having good health and well-being, quality education, et cetera. And so in the process of developing pathways to achieving these goals, soil has been situated at the center of our progress towards doing that. And what's important about that is that we have lost about 120 billion metric tons of soil over time. What I wanted to show you, just to kind of put that in context, is these two maps. And these maps were published in 2017. By the way, if you all are interested in any of the papers that we reference, we can share the paper or the citations with Elizabeth and Tracy after the presentation. But the first graph is showing you across the globe what are the land uses, the primary agricultural land uses. So everywhere that you see red, there's cropland, and everywhere that you see green, there is grazing land. On the bottom figure, you're looking at soil carbon loss across the globe. So anything that's blue is actually places where soil carbon is accruing. And so most of that you're seeing is going to be in the Northern Hemisphere. That is areas that are reforesting. Anywhere that you see that's kind of yellow is representing an average amount of soil carbon loss, and anything that you see in orange and red is showing high amounts of carbon loss. So you'll see that there are kind of these hotspots in the Midwestern US, in parts of Europe, and in parts of China, and that all represents carbon loss due to deforestation, but also the conversion of grasslands into cropland to produce feeds for humans and for livestock. While it's pretty tragic that we have such drastic soil carbon losses, there's also great potential to store that carbon and mitigate some of the carbon dioxide emissions that are driving climate change. And so a new concept that has emerged in the last decade or so is this idea of natural climate solutions. And when you look at this figure where you see NCS, that's referring to natural climate solutions. The idea of natural climate solutions is that we can adjust our land uses, management practices, and conservation measures to draw down carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and store it in natural forms. So what you're looking at in this figure is on the x-axis, the year 2000 up to the year 2050, and on the y-axis, global carbon emissions in petagrams of carbon dioxide per year. So you'll see that from about 2000 to a little after 2010, our emissions increased from 30 to somewhere close to about 40 petagrams of carbon dioxide per year. And if we were to continue emitting the way that we are, that value will more than double by 2050. And that feels a little bit alarming because we're in 2021 now, that's only, 29 years from now that that we can expect this over doubling in carbon dioxide emissions, and that puts us above the 2 degrees Celsius warming target that's been set for us to try to minimize the severe impacts of climate change on human life as we know it. This green line that you're seeing is the line that's required to limit warming to less than 2 degrees Celsius. And the colored spaces in between show what role different approaches have to achieving this goal. One of the things I want to point out is that there are 2 shown in this figure. And the point of that is that there's no one solution that's going to reverse climate change. This is something that sectors have to work towards together. And while the vast majority of that mitigation needs to come from fossil fuel mitigation, so things like switching to electric, carbon capture and storage technologies, there's a good percentage of this that can be addressed through natural climate solutions. And so in a study that was published in 2018, they estimated that if you implement a suite of natural climate solutions, you could mitigate about 20% of the net annual emissions from the US in 2016. And the suite of practices that they consider spanned practices you could implement in forests, agriculture, and grasslands and wetlands. Again, driving home that the natural climate solutions themselves include things like grazing, but they also include cropland management, and beyond that, forest and wetland management. And what I want to kind of show here is that the greatest, or what I want to point out here is that the greatest climate mitigation potential as a single practice is reforestation and some forest management tools. But there are also significant contributions to that total mitigation figure that comes from avoiding grassland conversion through improved cropland management techniques, the use of cover crops, the potentials for biochar, the use of alley cropping, better nutrient management, and grazing optimization, which is related to stocking rates and grazing management practices, similar to what would come up under the philosophies that underpin regenerative agriculture. So these authors would argue that there is significant potential for soil carbon sequestration to mitigate some of our environmental impacts and contribute to achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. And there are a few pros and cons of using soil carbon sequestration for this purpose. First, soil carbon sequestration is relatively low cost. There are known technologies and practices that can be used to at least capture carbon in soil. And there are many benefits beyond just climate mitigation. So again, we mentioned earlier, the presence of soil carbon is important for water cycling, for nutrient cycling. These practices can be associated with improved biodiversity. So climate mitigation alone is not the only benefit of increasing our soil carbon sequestration. We can reduce the need for new land in agriculture, which avoids that grassland conversion, which is what you're seeing in the first bar in the ag and grassland section. And but there are a few cons. The first is that soil carbon sequestration is hard to quantify. And Dr. McMuller is going to go into a little more detail about why soil carbon sequestration is hard to quantify. And a bigger challenge or con is that we're not sure, where there's uncertainties about how long you can keep the carbon in the soil. And I don't want to go too much into that because Dr. McMuller is going to talk more, but I do want to kind of stick it in your heads that we have to think about not only getting carbon into soils, but keeping it there. And that's the part that we're not sure about. How are we going to keep it there? So let's drill this down a little bit further from this macro view of soils into carbon cycles on the farm. Most of you are familiar with this cycle, so I'm just going to go quickly, but I like to kind of ground our conversation in this before we delve into the soils themselves. So plants absorb energy from the sun, which powers the carbon cycle. Those plants take that energy, they capture carbon dioxide, and they use it to grow. They use it to release oxygen back into the atmosphere. As they grow and develop roots, they feed microbes in the soil, which contributes to the formation of soil organic matter and therefore the carbon stored in the soil organic matter. Those microbes also respire and they release some carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere. Animals consume those plants and release the carbon back to the atmosphere as carbon dioxide and methane. Those gases cycle back through the atmosphere and eventually are taken back down by plants. But the soil itself, many of you probably have heard the term, soil is a living organism. And then we talk about soil carbon kind of as a single entity. But soil carbon is not created equal. And let's think about let's delve into a little bit about why all carbon is not created equal. So when we think about soil carbon just from a broad perspective as one entity, there are a few ways that soil carbon sequestration can happen. First, you can increase the inputs of carbon. So you can increase carbon capture, right? So the use of cover crops to keep that living root in the ground can help capture carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. The use of manures and compost can return carbon from byproducts and waste of crop production, or crop processing can return that carbon back to the soil. You can use rotations, you can add biochar, you can increase, you can use perennialization, so increase the amount of perennial plants that are in the landscape. You can use crop breeding techniques to develop plants that develop, to select for plants that develop more extensive root systems. And you could also integrate livestock into the system. So you can either increase the inputs with no change in the outputs, or you can decrease the outputs. So you can decrease carbon losses by using no or minimum tillage, using practices that reduce erosion, avoiding drainage, and maintaining cover on the land. But the way that you would optimize these approaches is by increasing the efficiency of soil organic carbon conversion. And there are questions for this one instead of check marks, because we still have lots to learn about how nitrogen management and plant microbe relationships impact the increase in efficiency of soil organic carbon conversions. In the interest of time, okay, I'm going to keep going. So there's lots of uncertainty here, but we will talk a little bit about the role that plant microbiome and especially and nitrogen management play in keeping that carbon in the soil. So let's come back to this dilemma of capturing carbon in the soil and keeping it in the soil. And I'm going to turn it over to Meg to take us through this concept.
Thanks, Jasmine. So we often call this a soil carbon dilemma, because if we want to sequester more carbon, but we know that we need to maintain efficient cycling of this carbon, because that cycling of that carbon stored in organic matter is essential for the supply of plant available nutrients. So we call this a carbon dilemma because can we increase soil carbon storage while also increasing nutrient mineralization and the natural provision of fertility? And this was proposed as the soil carbon dilemma back in 2006. And we've learned a lot since then. And I think this point captures the imminent need to consider soil carbon sequestration goals and soil health goals. They need to be intricately connected, because maintaining soil health through the cycling of that carbon, the cycling of that organic matter, is extremely important, and to the productivity of the system. And of course, accruing that carbon is important in terms of soil carbon sequestration and climate mitigation potential. Next slide. So Jasmine said, not all soil carbon is made equal. This makes it extremely complex. Soil carbon is amazingly complex, made of thousands of different chemicals that remain from the decomposition and transformation of plants, animals, and microorganisms. But one key distinction that can provide an underlying framework for soil carbon management is this framework of particulate organic matter versus mineral associated organic matter. And I'll refer to these as an acronym interchangeably with their names throughout. So so this is POM, or particulate organic matter, and MOM, mineral associated organic matter. Next slide. So we can think of the POM, the particulate organic matter, as the vulnerable pool. Not only are these two pools different in their chemical makeup, so POM is what you can see. It contains partially decomposed organic fragments like roots and leaves and certain plant compounds. And MOM, next, is what we considered protected. So this is the microscopic coatings of organic matter on soil particles that are mainly derived from from microorganisms, their bodies, and the byproducts of microbes and microorganisms and their decomposition. This can also contain more labile or easily used or accessible simple compounds that leach from plant roots. And so their chemical makeup is very different, but also their physical state, like I mentioned before. So mineral associated organic matter is what we considered protected. It sticks to clay particles and can remain in the soil for much longer than the particular organic matter. The particular organic matter life cycle is anywhere from 1 to 50 years, so it's faster cycling. While the mineral associated organic matter is more slow cycling in the order of decades to thousands of years and even centuries. And this is because of that intricate connection with clay particles. It's harder to access by the microbes, and so therefore is harder to decompose and then be released into the soil or back into the atmosphere. One more thing on that. So also you'll see the boxes, the carbon to nitrogen boxes. So importantly, the nutrient contents contained in these two distinct pools are different. Particular organic matter, being plant fragments or roots, has a higher carbon to nitrogen ratio than mineral associated organic matter. And this goes back to the origin of what is this organic matter. So mineral associated organic matter is primarily composed of these microbial bodies. Microbes themselves have a low carbon and nitrogen ratio because they need much nitrogen to grow and to synthesize enzymes and to decompose organic matter. So importantly, these nutrient contents are different. And that becomes important when thinking about the dynamics and how we might manage these two pools. Okay, next slide. Okay, and then a useful way of thinking about these two pools is like a savings and a checking account. So particular organic matter is often what we refer to as the checking account. So the checking account receives money every day, every payday, right? Not every day. Well, maybe every day, that'd be nice. Every payday, but gets spent fairly quickly to cover everyday expenses. So again, this is a faster cycling pool, like the checking account. Alternatively, the mineral associated organic matter pool, next slide, is like the savings account. So this usually receives less money from each paycheck, but that money isn't spent as quickly. So when humans face a big unexpected expense, they typically drain their checking account and may also dip into their savings account. And if this happens over and over again, eventually both accounts go broke. And so we can think of this as the accounting of soil carbon. And I found that a useful framework to consider when thinking about the function of these two different pools of carbon in the soil. Next slide. So using this framework, this POM and MOM framework, and separating the carbon into these two distinct pools is important for several reasons. We're able to assess, first of all, the vulnerability to disturbance. So like I said before, the particulate organic matter or the POM pool is more vulnerable to disturbance, such as tillage or like erosion. And while the mineral associated organic matter is far less vulnerable and sticks around. Another important, these are important to assess the potentials for carbon sequestration. So if we're managing for carbon to stick around for a long time, then we'll really want to build up that mineral associated organic matter pool, the savings account. Also important, this framework to help for management strategies, so that we can guide management to build up either particular organic matter, mineral associated organic matter, or hopefully both of them, because both are necessary. They perform very different functions, but looking at splitting the carbon into these different fractions is very useful in these contexts. Okay, so importantly though, not all soils behave the same, and not all soils have the same potential to sequester carbon. So this graph shows here on the y-axis, on the left-hand side, the mineral associated organic matter pool, and the left-hand side, particular organic matter versus the total organic carbon in the soil. So the first thing you might notice on the left-hand side, the mineral associated organic matter pool can saturate over time, while the particular organic matter can continue to accrue. And these dynamics will be dependent upon your starting point. So how much carbon is in your soil, and in what form does it exist? So this will of course be dependent on previous land use. So a disturbed landscape that has undergone conventional tillage for multiple years will likely have far less carbon. So be starting on the left-hand side of that graph compared to a native prairie, for example. So your starting point matters. This the starting point is also dependent on what type of ecosystem you're in. So grasslands, which are in the blue dots, and forests are in the red dots. So grasslands have greater proportion of mineral associated organic matter compared to forests. So your mineral associated organic matter in grasslands is much higher. And so depending on the proportion of what exists will also influence where you fall at in that line and what your potential is to sequester additional carbon in these pools. Another thing, let's see, what else did I want to point out here? So while you see that saturation dynamic in the mineral associated organic matter pool, it's important to note that most soils are far below their saturation, especially in agricultural soils. Like Jasmine showed before, we've lost a substantial amount of carbon in our agricultural soils. And so we're starting at a lower point on the left-hand side of that point. So we have a lot of room to grow. But also deeper soils are generally, there's a lot of potential there. And why is there a lot of potential in deeper soils? You generally have greater amount of mineral surfaces as you go deeper. So important to the mineral associated organic matter pool, there has to be mineral surfaces. So the greater amounts of clay, the greater amounts of surfaces available, the greater potential to sequester carbon in that pool. Okay, next slide. Okay, so this drives home kind of what I was saying for that last point. So carbon in the mineral associated organic matter pool is dependent on soil texture. So in this graph, you have the silt and clay content as percentage, and the carbon stored in your silt and clay content on the y-axis. So this would be like your mineral associated organic matter pool. So depending on how much silt and clay your soil has, will dictate what the potential for carbon to accrue in that fraction, how much carbon can accrue in that fraction. And of course, there's different clays, but generally speaking, this trend follows the percentage of silt and clay in your soil. And so this also will, depending on where your starting point is, and I already mentioned this, depending on how much carbon is already in your silt and clay fraction, that will determine how much more additional carbon can be added to that to your clays or to that mineral associated organic matter fraction. Okay. Importantly, so I talked about this before, but the carbon in the particular organic matter fraction is more vulnerable to disturbance. And so this is just data that's driving that message home. So this particular on the on the x-axis there, this is several different studies in 3 different locations that were either went through grassland conversion or tillage. And there's 2 types of tillage in the first site, Akron there on the left-hand side, conservation tillage and conventional tillage. The particular organic matter stocks are shown in yellow, and the mineral associated organic matter stocks are shown in blue. And basically, what I wanted to show here is that, with conventional tillage, for example, on the left-hand side, the particular organic matter pool depletes much greater than the mineral associated organic matter pool. So again, just data showing that that particular organic matter pool that is not intricately connected and formed bonds with clay minerals will be more vulnerable to disturbance and loss. Okay, next one. So improving grassland management, this has high potential for soil carbon sequestration. This was a review of multiple studies compiled together that showed different types of grassland management and their effect on the soil carbon sequestration rate. Those are the bars you see. The numbers that are given above the bars are just the amount of studies that were compiled and averaged for this analysis. So the types of grassland management that this review analyzed were things like fertilization, improved grazing, sowing legumes, earthworm activity, irrigation, and sowing grasses. And so what you see is individually, each of these practices has the potential to sequester more carbon in, with the implementation of these practices. And why might that be? If we go back to the biophysics that Jasmine explained, either increasing there's one of 3 ways, either increasing the inputs to the system, decreasing the outputs, or increasing or enhancing the efficiency of that cycling below ground. And it's not to say that one happens and the other doesn't. All of these 3 things can happen in tandem. And these types of practices can influence those processes. Okay, I'll just go ahead and move on to the next slide. So this study, this is a new study and it's not published, it's in review. And this was in adapted multi-paddock grazing systems, and on the map here, one in Kentucky, Tennessee, a few in Alabama, and Louisiana. And what they found with the fence-to-fence comparison to conventional tillage, so the AMP grazing is on the left-hand side and the conventional tillage on the right-hand side, they found, this is a PhD work by Sam Mosier in the Francesco Trufo lab at Colorado State University. They found that AMP grazing significantly enhances carbon stocks down the profile to 1 meter deep. Next slide. And importantly, this practice, AMP grazing, also increased the distribution of carbon and nitrogen stocks, carbon, toward more persistent and less vulnerable minerally associated organic matter fraction. So that more stable fraction. And this is just showing the distribution of depths on the bottom. So this was consistent down to 1 meter deep. Next slide. I know we're running out of time, so I'll just kind of move through this quickly. One thing that I did want to point out, because this gets brought up quite a bit, is that nitrogen is very important for carbon sequestration to occur. And if we think about the chemical makeup of the mineral associated organic matter pool, has a low carbon to nitrogen ratio, so higher nitrogen contents. Nitrogen is needed for the processing and turnover of this carbon, and therefore the sequestration of carbon below ground. So more nitrogen in systems generally, because microbes need nitrogen for their processing of the carbon. Generally, we have a more efficient soil organic matter use, and that can lead to more persistent mineral-associated organic matter. And like I showed you before, the carbon, not only did the carbon stocks increase with AMP grazing, but also the nitrogen stocks. So showing that carbon and nitrogen often move in tandem, and without nitrogen, carbon sequestration, the potential decreases. Okay. So I just said this. So this is just reiterating what I said. And again, looking at the C to N ratios, the mineral associated organic matter C to N is lower than the particulate, and that's why nitrogen is necessary. And so nitrogen is essential for carbon sequestration, and we must quantify nitrogen in order to understand carbon sequestration potentials. Go ahead. But of course, with nitrogen, this may also result in enhanced nitrous oxide emissions. So the carbon and nitrogen cycles are intricately linked, and not only can nitrogen promote carbon sequestration, but it also may enhance a potent greenhouse gas emission, such as nitrous oxide, which is much more potent than carbon dioxide. And so, this whole cycle and what results not just with the carbon, but also with the nitrogen is important to consider when thinking about carbon sequestration potentials. Okay. This is just another example from a study that I did in Georgia on another intensive grazing system, rotational grazing system in dairy farms. And this was land that was converted from primarily cotton farming to this rotational grazing system. And we saw a significant amount of carbon sequestration as a result of this land use conversion and implementation of these grazing practices. Next slide. And again, another case study for you done in the upper Midwest in Michigan in grass-fed beef systems compared to feedlot finished. And the AMP grazing systems also in this area in the upper Midwest also led to significant, which was 3.6 megagrams of carbon per hectare per year sequestration with implementation of these practices. Okay, so I'll try to go through this quickly, but I thought some of you might be interested. So how do we measure MOM and POM? Well, of course, we start out with collecting soil cores, and I recommend splitting your soil cores by horizon, because often with the implementation of these regenerative grazing practices, you're going to increase the depth, or the soil can grow, right? So your horizons can build. So it's important to keep track of how much soil you're adding to your horizon. So sampling by horizon helps us distinguish those effects, which may not be captured if you're just sticking to depths. And then to separate, once we separate, collect the soil cores, we take it back to the lab and sieve the soils, and we can separate MOM and POM in two different ways, either by size or density. And this just shows that the density fractionation, so you basically put the soil in a very heavy, highly dense solution, and what floats is the particular organic matter, what sinks is the heavy clay associated organic matter, and then we further separate that heavy organic matter by size to look specifically at the clay fraction. That can be silt and clay mixed in, and Colorado State University is now accepting soils. I think the first service facility to accept soils, and they will run this analysis for you. So this is a really exciting development at Colorado State. Okay, onward. But I do want to say that this is a very time-intensive process, and it's very laborious. But we are at Colorado State, we are in the process of developing instruments for automatic processing of these soil samples, so that this process of separating and fractionating the soils can be done much more efficiently, and hopefully definitely more efficient should also improve, bring down the costs as well. I won't go into much more detail there to save time, but a new development at CSU is the Soil Carbon Solutions Center. Our mission is we've combined faculty from various colleges, including economics, social scientists, biogeochemists, ecologists, water scientists, and our aim is to develop not only do the research, but develop the tools necessary to help guide management and producers to sequester carbon in their soils. Okay.
Okay, so I'll go through the key takeaways quickly so we have some time for questions. So kind of a broad zooming back out, grazing management has the potential to enhance soil carbon sequestration as a part of a suite of natural climate solutions. Soil carbon is partitioned into two pools. There's the MOM, which is the savings account, the long-term protected storage. And there's the POM, which is the checking account, the shorter term, more vulnerable storage. Grasslands accumulate more of their organic matter as MOM, while forests accumulate more of their organic matter as POM. And MOM can saturate because of physical constraints, specifically the amount of clay in soil, like Megan was talking about. While MOM saturates, POM can continue to accumulate carbon, and both of these things require that there's nitrogen present in the system. So with those, I want to open up for questions, and I've put our contact information here in case any of you have more questions for either of us. You can email us individually. And with that, I will stop the share, and then we can open up for questions from the audience.
So I would suggest if people have a question, they could raise their hand since there's so many of us. And also if you want to put in, if you're more comfortable putting your question into the chat, please feel free to do that also. So I saw Steve, I think, do you have a question?
Oh, I was just clapping. That was a great presentation. Thank you.
Oh.
But I do have a question.
Thank you.
Like how generalizable are these results? So how many, I mean, it looks like you had a lot of study sites across a lot of terrain. And anyway, I guess I asked my question, yeah.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And, you know, I would use caution with generalizing those results. While those particular grazing practices and those very different areas showed similar results in terms of their enhanced carbon sequestration, it will be, if you can think about it, it will be dependent upon the productivity, right? Your carbon inputs. So that's dependent on where you are, right? Your climate, your water, you know, which is temperature, water. It will be dependent on what type of soil you're on. So more clay soils, maybe greater potential to store carbon in that mineral associated organic matter fraction. It also will depend on previous land use history, because if you remember that graph, you know, that with the MOM and then the POM, right? So if you start this side, so like very low, if you start your soil carbon contents you start low, your potential is much greater. So your potential to build soil carbon will be much greater. So those are a few things that I think will you know, influence the trajectory and the potential magnitude of soil carbon sequestration. Does that help?
Qualitatively, it's okay when I'm teaching my undergrads, you know, for me to say, look, how this soil is managed can have a big impact on carbon sequestration, obviously, yeah.
Yes, yeah, cool.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks, Steve. Anyone else got questions?
Hi, yeah, I have a question. Sorry, I can't figure out how to raise my hand. That's okay.
Oh, that's fine.
Hi, John.
I'm a beef producer in Virginia, and you know, we do rotational grazing. We moved from continuous to rotational grazing several years ago, and we're kind of experimenting now with some management intensive grazing with more frequent moves. One of the things I've you know, I've sort of struggled with, and I don't know how to quantify this, is it seems like there's this continuum from one extreme being continuous grazing, the other extreme being, moving multiple times per day. And that the more often we move, the better we are at sequestering carbon. It's not kind of a binary thing like you are or you aren't, that there's some continuum there. And am I thinking about that correctly, or is there sort of the right way and the wrong way and no in between?
Do you want me to go, Megan? So,
Yeah, go for it.
I think, so you're right, that there's kind of a continuum there, right? And so sometimes folks will ask, and I'm simplifying this, but I heard it once, and I think it's funny. They'll say, should I rotate clockwise or should I rotate counterclockwise, or should I rotate on Thursdays to get more carbon? And I think it's, of course, it's a continuum, it's more complicated than that. And so the big thing that I always say is, when you think about the plants that you're managing in your pastures, whatever you can do to allow that plant to put down more root material so that it can feed the microbes that are feeding it, the more carbon that you can sequester in that system. And so that's going to be things like perennial plants in your rotation. Whether you're a crop producer, you may think about that as one of the crops you're rotating. As a beef producer, it's, you're grazing perennial crops. I just lost it. I lost the second example I was going to give, but when you're moving, as you probably know, when you're moving frequently, you're giving each parcel of land more time to rest, which allows that plant to put down more roots. Now, of course, you also have to be practical within the time you have to manage, and et cetera. But that's kind of how I distill it. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, that makes sense. So it's about rest, maybe not moving. That might be maybe that's the yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. But the moving gives the rest. So.
All right, thank you.
Thanks for your question.
Thank you.
It looks like we have one question in the chat. As an NRCS person, this may be our out of your wheelhouse, but wondering what is a good way to explain this to our farmers in terms of practical methods and how they can get paid for it.
So I'll tackle the practical methods part first, because I like to avoid carbon markets questions.
Yeah.
But so from explaining it in a practical way is usually I start with, okay, you have soil carbon as this pool, and people know as they get familiar with soil health principles that carbon stored in organic matter, the more organic matter you can get, the better. I take that a step further to say, okay, there's these two types of organic matter, these two types of carbon like Meg was talking about. One is protected and one is vulnerable. The way that you keep carbon in the soil for a longer period of time is getting more of the protected carbon. What the amount of protected carbon you can get is going to vary, but the amount of protected carbon that you can get is going to vary, and the science is still in its infancy in terms of which practices are directly linked to each type. And so one of the things is that you're going to come to a webinar like this again next year with new data, and you can tell the farmer next year I'll give you some updates on what we know about practices in different places. And so what I often do from a practical perspective is keep this in the back of your mind. Take your soil sample that hopefully goes deep enough to get a sample from the different horizons and send it. And I'm not just putting a plug for us, I'm using us as the example because to our knowledge, this is the only place you can do it. Send your sample to the Colorado State University Soil Carbon Solutions Lab, because we can test for MOM and POM across horizons. And that's where you get the data you need from your soil test to be able to track what's happening in your soils. In terms of getting paid for it, so I'm sure folks on the call are familiar with carbon markets. The reason I said I don't like talking about them is because they're very, I think that I'm not an economist, and they are an emerging opportunity, probably one which your ability to really get paid is going to differ based on your size and a number of other factors. So I'm not the one that has to bet the farm on it, and so I don't like to make recommendations one way or the other. But carbon markets are one way of getting paid for it. I've talked with folks about using it as a marketing tool. So if you're actually tracking change over time, you can put that in your brochure if you're marketing directly to your customers. You can use changes, you can use photos to show, like, look at how rich the soil is and look how it's changing over time. You can bring samples to the farmer's market. You can And then there are probably opportunities for value-added markets where you can actually use that data if you're collecting it to help, I guess, use this documentation to show your improvement. So those are a few examples. The next question was, you mentioned sending a soil sample deep enough. How deep is that? Meg, do you want to take that one?
Sure. And I think this will really this is really dependent upon your goals, right? So, you know, for example, carbon market verification, they have certain requirements, and that's generally, you know, in each verification is different. So I would definitely say look into, if that is the ultimate goal, then you'd have to look into those protocols and do what's specified there. But, you know, if you're just interested in changes over time, you know, the majority of the changes that occur over time or more quickly will happen in that A horizon. In that A horizon, which, you know, can vary, you guys probably know better than me, but, you know, anywhere from 15 to 30, 40 centimeters deep sometimes. But in order to really increase the resolution of detection, I always recommend splitting that A horizon to like the surface 15 centimeters, and send that as a separate sample, and then deeper 15 to 30 centimeters, or whatever to the bottom of the A horizon. I feel like the biggest changes will occur most quickly in the A horizon. Now, in grass systems, I mean, of course, there's a lot of deep-rooted grasses. And so some of those changes, like we saw in the example of the AMP grazing data that I showed you, even occurred down to 1 meter deep. So I guess it just depends on, first of all, how much money they'd like to invest in data collection, and also like what's the system and where do you expect the biggest changes to occur, and do you just want to focus on the top horizon? I'm happy to talk offline too, more about that and about your particular system, if you'd like.
Let's see. I put our emails in the chat if you all want to email Megan or myself with additional questions. With that, we have time for one more question. It looks like there's one in the chat. It says, does removal of greater percentages of grass tops, which results in more root sloughing as the plant regrows those tops, result in more microbe feeding, or is keeping more leaf area on the plants as grazing residual result in more momm? I'll make one kind of broad comment, and then Megan, you can take it over if you'd like. One of the things just to think about that I was going to say is, yes, the roots are sloughing off in the soil and feeding the microbes, but also the living plant is putting sugars into the soil that's feeding the microbes. So it's both actions are feeding the microbes in the soil. The microbes need both. So I wouldn't focus on just one or the other. But Megan, do you want to give some more comments on that? It looks like we're right at 12. So. Yeah,
no, I think that's great. I think you nailed it. I think, I mean, of course, there's a fine, you're walking the fine line between, you know, you want to continue to maximize productivity. And so, you know, not grazing, the grazing frequency or the grazing amount, right? On how much of those tops are taken off. You're kind of trying to balance boosting productivity enough so that those sugars through the roots themselves keep on going into the ground versus yeah, I don't know, it's a tricky, I think it's a fine balance.
Exactly. I'd say it's a question of balance, right? You're balancing a bunch of carbon cycles now when you think about removing tops. It's going to depend on the maturity of the plants as well,
right?
What the plants are. So
yes, right.
Balancing those.
Great. So I think that's all the questions we have for now. I just wanted to really say thank you so much, Jasmine and Megan, for your amazing presentation. Really informative. I think everyone has gotten so much from it. And thank you for sharing your contact information also, so that people can get in touch with you and your work. I also included my personal information, my email, and the link to future office hours. So please visit those when you have a chance. And I just want to say thank you all for joining, and have a good day.
Thanks all.
Thanks for having us. Thank you.